We begin with a collective chant of Om 5 times. In the chapter that we are studying of the synthesis of yoga, Sri Aurobindo describes the difficulties that the mind faces as it grows to approach the divine and to know the divine as Sat, Chit and Ananda. And we have seen through the last few pages not only each of these difficulties taken up and resolved by one more step forward, at which point we meet the next difficulty which is resolved, and so on through perhaps 4 or 5 stages. And we have reached now the last stage of the difficulty. In the first place, Sri Aurobindo had described how the mind is naturally a creature of finiteness and limitation, seeking to know something which is the very opposite. And so obviously it has to learn to become quiet, it has to learn to become passive and reflecting of that which it seeks to know and receive. And so there was the experience of the stilling of the mind and the mind becoming a reflector, attempting to rise out of its own limitation to some higher grade, or passing out of the mental consciousness in a state of swoon into that higher grade of experience, which then it must lose when it returns to its normal state of mind. The conclusion is the mind itself must be spiritualized if it has to be able to access and hold these higher states. And that brings us to the second possibility of the mind's approach, that instead of rising above, it brings down into itself, calls down the divine, and is gradually changed by repeated infusions of the divine consciousness into an image of the divine and eventually divinized. And again, for this purpose, it takes a poise of reflection, becomes very still in order to receive what comes. And that is not enough, Sri Aurobindo says. For the integral yoga, there has to be a positive transformation, not just a negative quiescence of the waking mind. And the transformation, as we saw, becomes possible because in the mind itself are finer gradations of diviner states which make possible for or represent things which belong to a higher plane in the mentality. And it is possible through these to open to and experience those higher states and derive from them their powers and experiences. And so in this way the mind is able as if to rise and open in its waking consciousness to a perception of the Satchidananda, at which point it has to struggle with the natural difficulty of the mind, which is it needs to divide, it needs to cut up any experience. So it sees the Sat or it sees the Chit or the Ananda in exclusion to the others, pushing those back or experiencing them as secondary aspects. And so he lists the whole spectrum of kinds of spiritual experience according to which of these the mind highlights, or it takes one aspect of the consciousness, the knowledge of the Satchidananda, the supramental consciousness, any one of its aspects, experiences it as a deity, and so on. But he then points out that in the integral yoga, all these have to be harmonized and placed in equal unity in their fullness. Now all of this is placed before us as an ideal. It means that in the journey of the sadhaka, he would dwell upon each of these aspects, not stopping short at any one to say, this is it, I have arrived. Which is normally the case, and often the case when an experience comes spontaneously and one has an overwhelming perception of some aspect of the divine. It is so overwhelming, it feels so complete that one stops there and says, this is it. And this is not difficult to slip, because any of these experiences of the divine tend to have an aspect of infinity. And for the mind, anything which is infinite is perceived as something that's complete. It is only when we have a background, as in this case, which Sri Aurobindo points out that there are many facets even within the infinities, many aspects to the divine, each of which is experienced infinitely. It's only when we know this that we recognize, okay, whatever you have experienced is a first step, and there are others. And so in the act of mapping them out, Sri Aurobindo ensures that the sadhaka of the integral yoga does not stop short. And in the first opening of whatever the experience, we discover that by turning our attention, by concentrating on the other aspects associated with these, the experience naturally opens out. If at first there is the experience of the Sat, a sheer existence, infinite, one dwells on it, and after a while one becomes conscious that it is utterly conscious. It is consciousness that is existence. And the second aspect of it begins to open, and so on. You will recall Sri Aurobindo's own experience, which he narrates, when he first had the experience of the nirvana, and he dwelt in it, he achieved it in 3 days. And then he dwelt in it for several months, when everything of the world had become as if unreal, all forms, all forces, all beings fading into some kind of insubstantiality or artificiality against the intense completeness of this vast freedom and emptiness of the nirvana. And after several months of having lived in its overwhelming imprint, he was tempted to recognize that this is it. And something within him said, wait. And after a while, something began to fill the emptiness. A vast, positive, affirming consciousness settling from above, filling the emptiness. And one wonders, what was it that indicated to wait? And how did the second aspect of the experience begin? One can approach it in different ways in answering this question. If we recognize that the true sadhaka, the one who leads the sadhana and does the sadhana in us, ultimately is the divine. Because there's nothing else in us which is really capable of doing anything beyond its own limitations. All that we call ourselves is made up of what? Pieces, finitenesses, defined by limitations. We are like a little doll that's made up of little plastic pieces joined together. Okay, a little more complex perhaps, but nevertheless made up of pieces, defined by limitations. And if you ask yourself, what is it in us that wants to go beyond this, that yearns for a higher or deeper or a spiritual possibility? And if you explore within yourself, there is nothing in the mind or in the impulse of our life energies or in the constitution of our body which has anything remotely aspiring or knowing a higher possibility. The only thing we can recognize is somewhere deep inside, in some hidden cave perhaps, of which we are barely conscious. Somewhere deep inside is something that knows. It knows that it's possible. It knows that this is not enough. What is possible? And if you ask it, you don't know. It just knows that this is insufficient and something more is awaiting. And if you try to feel what is it that it yearns for as something more, you will see it reflect in our mind and in our emotions, in anyone's normal life, as something yearning for things beautiful, things true, things harmonious, happy, healthy, meaning not broken, not limited, not bound. And that's the first level at which it reflects. And when you do crave for the beautiful things and the happy things and the harmonious things and gather those things around you, that thing still says not this, something more true, something more beautiful, something more real. It's not satisfied. And if you try to feel at that point, not so much in your emotions but in your highest ideals, what is it that it is yearning for? And you will use words like true love, perfect harmony, perfect beauty. And if you ask this mind and idealism to define what do you mean by this perfect harmony or true love, you find yourself stumbling for words. You cannot quite articulate what it is you're sensing, but you sense something. And what you sense is on an ideal so far away that there is nothing in life that corresponds to it. But the few attempts to approach it are what make life meaningful. Even though you fail, having approached a little more is what makes for fulfillment in your art, in your poetry, in your dreams, or in your life. Where you yearn for true love, a few moments perhaps, a few seconds is all that you might glimpse, but those are enough to make all the rest that comes with it worthwhile. You seek for perfection or beauty, and something is done, a small object, a small effort, a small movement perhaps, a little construction, fragile, insecure, and that is enough to give you deep fulfillment. A step forward is all that is needed. And where does all this come from? In a part of you of which you're not even conscious. Of course, we know from our reading and our understanding that it is the divine presence within us. We may say our own inmost, deepest, truest soul. But we are not even conscious of that. From there it reflects and inevitably drives the journey of our life. And so when we look at the whole question of what is it in us that yearns for and then pursues and then does the sadhana, nothing of our personality that we are aware of really is even aspiring. It is that thing deep within, that divine presence, not only which aspires, but which nudges the rest of us to pursue the sadhana. And so if we ask the question, who is it that is doing the sadhana? Finally we come to the recognition that it is the divine within. And it is that light illumining our mind, our will, our heart, our emotions, our actions, which leads them, nudges them, and carries the whole of your personality together, makes it more cohesive, aligning around that central light through many reflections perhaps, and leads. And so when you look at it this way, the journey being led by the divine seated deep within, if our pursuit is sincere, as we reach a stage in the experience that seems to be complete and overwhelming, and we are tempted to say, this is it. The we that says this is it is this mind. Or something of your emotions which feels satisfied. But that within which knows, which always knew, because it knew the ideal even before anything on the surface could reflect it, that knows and gently puts out a message, wait. But at that point, if our pursuit was not sincere, and what do we mean by that? There are parts in us which are not aligned to that inner aspiration, but parts which seek their own satisfaction. I want to be a great yogi. I want to achieve a great consciousness. I want to do something, help the world, change the situation. Whatever it is that you seek for which the sadhana is worthwhile, is a limiting factor. That part can come forward and say, this is enough for what I want. You will see in Sri Aurobindo's own journey, he describes of how he began the journey. It was at a time when I think he was visiting some family member who was sick, and a sannyasi came at the door, asked for a glass of water, and made a cut across the water, reciting some mantras, and said, give it to the man who is sick. The man drinks this water and is well. And Sri Aurobindo thinks, if one can have this power to free the country, that would be worth it. And that's how his first journey begins, and he starts the practices of pranayama and meditations, of whatever it is that he had access to at that point, to gain power to free the country, because that was the full focus of his commitment to life. And of course, as that pursuit begins, the inner dimensions begin to open and unfold. The whole sense of why you're doing the sadhana changes, because you change. And later he says, starting from doing it for oneself or for the country, it moves to doing it for humanity. The sadhana turns for the liberation of humanity. That's the time when he is asked to leave the political pursuit. He is given the assurance that the movement is set in motion. It will be done. There will be other instruments who will do the rest of the work. Now you have to focus on something larger. And at that point it is for humanity, for the liberation not just of India but of humanity. From what? Not just colonial rule, from ignorance itself. And then he says at a later stage, even that changed. And then he says the sadhana is not just for humanity, it is for the divine. And then the whole picture changes, because you ask yourself, who is doing the sadhana and for what? And increasingly as your own consciousness unfolds, you realize you or humanity or even the universe are a form and expression of the hidden secret divinity unfolding its potential. When in that wide consciousness you look at the whole universe, what is the universe really? It is a bursting out of the divine consciousness, taking on forms, and through forms revealing more and more of itself. Who is evolving? The divine. The divine first takes a poise of sleeping, and then we see stone. And in a first movement of waking up, and we experience the formation of plants. A first movement of feelings, and we call those animals. A first emergence into thought and self-awareness, we call it humanity, Homo sapiens. But who's doing it? It is the divine always in and through these forms emerging, revealing himself to what? To his own perception, because there is nothing else. And when you see the whole experience in this vast picture, who is doing the sadhana? The divine. For what? Well, for the unfolding of the divine. There is no one else, there is nothing else. All are merely representations of the divine. And so, when you look at it this way, you can say the sadhana is for the divine. But already in this perspective, my life, my struggles have faded to something which is much wider and freer. And I'm going through all these in detail because when we dwell on each of these steps, we recognize that somewhere within us, each one of us is taking these steps. Each one of us grows through these stages. And although somewhere within us there was always a true seeking for the Spirit, in its first reflections in our thoughts and emotions, there is always the personal ego that ceases to do the sadhana for something, for some immediate benefit, for some, at the very least, a release from suffering, for some resolution of my life problems. There is always this element of a personal interest or drive, and it's legitimate. It's what helps the ego align and participate a little bit, except it doesn't know that there's a trick. As the ego begins to align and participate, it does not know that it is being changed secretly from within. And by the time it realizes, oh, my ego itself is dissolving and changing, it's too late. So there is this interesting story, or we can put it as a story. When people say, let's say someone says, when I meet God, I will teach him a lesson of how to make the universe better. The catch in this story is this, that as he approaches to meet God, his own consciousness changes so much that he begins to see things from the higher standpoint. Until by the time he reaches the poise of the divine perspective, he says, oh, this is perfect. I couldn't improve on it. So the catch is, you may start in any position with whatever self-limited interest and accept that as a first step. And as you grow, your own consciousness, who you are, changes so fundamentally that all your motivations also outgrow their early limitations. All of this is to point out that in Sri Aurobindo's journey, as we see this awakening, there is something leading that says, wait, something more to come. And if we are sincere and if we have not allowed these personal interests to limit ourselves and turn the experience to a partiality, something within guides us to its further development. And that is what the whole story is about. You perceive an aspect first, through that something more unfolds, through that something more. And if you know and if you have accepted that your approach is of an integral yoga for an integral realization, you are led, you are assisted. So I said there are many ways we can approach this question. This is one way. The other way is, of course, the Divine Himself presides over your journey from above. Whatever the limitation of your experience, if you wait, if you have that faith, and if you let yourself remain in a quiet, still, aspiring state, He leads and takes you to His own fullness. So the question now of all these multiple facets of experience, we dwell upon each and can consciously develop them with the reference of what Sri Aurobindo offers as a roadmap, or simply, even if you didn't have that, as Sri Aurobindo did not, led by the inner guide or the Lord Master of our journey from above, who leads and reveals. And so he says, but the sadhaka of the integral yoga has to harmonize all these experiences, so that they may become a plenary and equal unity of the full realization of Satchidananda. To put it in terms which are more accessible to the human mind, we have to say, we can approach the Divine in many ways and know Him in many degrees. But to know Him as He knows Himself is the fullness of the experience. And to know Him as He knows Himself, you have to know Him by His power of awareness, by His power of cognition. An ant can climb on your foot and say, I know you. And yes, it is true, it knows you, but by its limited capacity. And the same, perhaps growing to become a squirrel, can know you much more, and the same taking form as a dog can know you much more, and the same as a human can know you as a human because he is himself human and knows humanity far better than a dog could know. But until you become one with that which you wish to know, in the very knowledge of His self-awareness, you do not truly know. And the Divine's self-awareness, His self-knowledge, is by that power of knowledge, of cognition that we have called the supramental. It is not mental, it is supramental. It is innately infinite, indivisible, one awareness. And so the mind starts with an approach, grows more and more, but at some point it has to reach a poise where all these different facets tend to merge, but still there are facets that it holds, even if they merge. Eventually there will be a step into a consciousness where they cease to be facets, but one whole. Multiple aspects, you can say, of highlighting itself, but always one single whole experience. As an analogy, and only as an analogy, if you observe within yourself, in a very physical experience, you have a left hand and a right hand. You could focus only on the hand. All the rest is not yet available to your awareness. So you have two hands and they contradict each other. They are opposite of each other. They clash. They can never join. They can at best entangle, but they can never be one. Isn't it? They're different forms. But if your consciousness grows beyond the hand and knows itself to be the arms, then you say, but they are complementary. One hand could not do what it has to do without the other hand supporting. And there is one consciousness which takes this poise and that poise. But still you have the duality, either this poise or that poise. And then there is one more status behind where I am one consciousness, of which my left hand, right hand are only at best aspects. But the consciousness is not split, it's not two. It is always one, which moves in a single action using these different hands, fingers, or none of them. And this gives you a sense through the analogy of what that transition is like. So at this point we are at a stage where all these different facets of experience have to be fully developed and harmonized. And then the last difficulty of the mind comes up. Here, the last difficulty of mind meets him, its inability to hold at once the unity and the multiplicity. It is not, now this part is the, recall we have looked at harmonizing a multiplicity of different experiences. But there is a poise where you hold a one awareness, one experience, and then there is a poise where you entered each of these separately. These two seem to be unable to be harmonized. And this is the challenge before us now. And we'll see why he gives so much importance to this. But let's see what is the difficulty he describes and how it is to be dealt with. He writes, "It is not altogether difficult to arrive at and dwell in a pure infinite, or even at the same time a perfect global experience of the existence, capital E, which is consciousness, capital C, which is delight, capital D." So here, all this, he says, is not altogether difficult to arrive at and dwell in. We'll come back to this, to study this more. The mind may even extend its experience of this unity to the multiplicity. So you're experiencing the world, and there is this poise of some sense of a pure infinite, or an existence, or a consciousness, or delight. And it's not just as a backdrop, it's not just as a support behind. You begin to perceive it in the world, so as to perceive it immanent in the universe and in each object, force, movement in the universe. Or at the same time to be aware of this existence, consciousness, bliss containing the universe and enveloping all its objects and originating all its movements. So he has already given us 3 broad gradations of experience, and we'll look at each of them in some detail. All of these are possible. Then what is difficult beyond this? It is difficult indeed for it to unite and harmonize rightly all these experiences. So you have this, you have that, or any variation of these, but how do you bring them all together? Because the divine is all of these at the same time. But still, it can possess Satchidananda at once in himself and immanent in all and continent of all. Even this is an extent one could push it to. But with this, to unite the final experience of all this as Satchidananda and possess objects, movements, forces, forms as no other than he is the great difficulty for mind. So core of the difficulty is really in that last step where you experience every object, force, movement, form as the divine, as the Lord himself. This part is the most difficult. You can experience things carried by the divine as if one vast ether into which the universe floats and all these float. Or you experience the divine flowing, filling, pushing things, immanent in all things. But that every object is that. Separately, any of these things may be done. The mind may go from one to the other, rejecting one as it arrives at another, and calling this lower or that higher existence. But to unify without losing, to integralize without rejecting, is its supreme difficulty. And with this he ends the chapter. So the difficulties of the mind have been classified, taken to this last final extreme. And the next chapter deals with how at all this last unification is to be realized. Before we look at the actual steps of the experiences described, because they're all very important and worth dwelling upon in our understanding and meditation, contemplation, I want to deal with the core question. Why does he take it to this extreme? Why not be satisfied with the experience of the divine immanence? If you see everything filled with the divine presence, if you see and experience the divine presence initiating all the movements, the flower blooms because the divine presence within pushes and wants to reveal and manifest itself. You feel the divine presence within each object. You feel every object surrounded by that. And the divine presence is existence, consciousness, bliss in yourself and in all. Why not stop there and say, this is good, this is complete, everything is now divine? And here comes the very important key to Sri Aurobindo's approach. If you stop here, you would still have the limitation of form. The form itself is at best a container. The presence is immanent inside the form. The presence is supporting the form. This presence is revealing through form. But the form, as a container, is not it. And what would be the result of that? Something remains which is not divine. A tiny gap, a tiny crack in the experience of the universe and the whole cosmos as being divine, a tiny crack. And if you allow that crack and say it's a small thing, does not matter, I'm complete in this experience. Bit by bit the crack extends itself. If here there's a gap, it is also extending into the next, and into the next, and into the next. And before you know it, the whole experience of reality begins slowly to separate out. All that belongs to that little crack on this side of the crack, not a divine yet, or not directly experienced as divine, begins to separate itself out, pulling with it all the things which depend on it. And what's the end result? All that is essentially defined by form breaks out. And what is defined by form, if you look at the whole cosmos on all the levels of consciousness? Matter. In all other planes, form is secondary. Energy is first, mind is first, awareness is first, and so on. You have thought form, but thought is the primary substance. Form is its reflection, expression. Matter is the one domain where form is first. What is the content of this form? Yes, there is some life energy, there is some thought, idea behind. But form is what first exists. And that's why it can lock up everything else. It can cover up, conceal, opening the way for the experience of evolution. Because form can lock up, the Satchidananda can hide inside form, and you have the appearance of inconscience, dead matter, empty space, nothing, no consciousness, nothing existing. And it hides inside the form and it begins to creep out, and then you say, yes, but in this empty space there is a seething energy. In this dead matter, I see the movement of self-organizing energy, of crystalline structures and life evolving. And that's nothing but the Satchidananda which was hidden inside form now beginning to creep out a little bit and a little bit. And the whole evolution is nothing but that. Satchidananda hidden inside form, revealing itself through form. But form is this rigid, hard, solid, limiting barrier. And so if you look in the totality of all the planes of the cosmos, if you allow this one crack where form is not yet divine, it's only a container, that one crack eventually extends, separating out the entire domain of matter. And what's the conclusion you will have? This is not divine or cannot be divine. Sri Aurobindo points to this. A very interesting article where he says this was the limitation of the Vedic experience. It realized the divine, it realized the supramental consciousness and brought it into the mind, and even the transformation of the mind, the supramentalization of the mental consciousness. Of course, in individuals, not yet in the collective. But it did not bring it to matter. It did not accept matter as divine in the depth of the experience. Why? Because we can simply say that was the maximum that the current evolution was ready for, that the earth's consciousness could support. And they did what had to be done at that point. It defined an entire era for the next 10,000 years up to today. It has defined and imprinted in earth the spirituality of the Veda. But that tiny crack, that tiny limitation, if I recall right in the text, Sri Aurobindo uses the phrase, the fatal flaw of the Vedic experience. That tiny crack eventually leads to the crisis which Buddhism has to face. Matter is a domain of suffering. Or the other form that Shankara gives to it, matter is a domain of illusion. Because there is no suffering ultimately, all being bliss. The suffering itself is illusory. The physical world is therefore illusory. This is the conclusion because of that one tiny crack, one tiny flaw of that experience. And then one has to go beyond this. And this is the work of Sri Aurobindo to complete for the Vedic realization by bringing it all the way down into matter. That matter itself is to be recognized as form and expression of the divine. And so this line where Sri Aurobindo takes it all the way to this limit, it may seem for us when we look at it from a very superficial angle and looking at the overwhelming description of these experiences and say, but isn't that enough? Why nitpick on such fine detail? Well, that fine detail is the key which could change everything or lose everything. So having understood this, we can go back to the text and look at the series of experiences it describes, recognizing why one has to go all the way to the last in the recognition, the perception of the divine in the world. So first he is describing a basic experience where he says it is not altogether difficult to arrive at and dwell in a pure infinite. He does not say it is easy. He says it is not difficult. And there's again a suggestion there. If it was easy, then it would be done without your effort. It's easy to wake up in the morning. You wake up not by your effort. Something inside wakes up. You get kicked awake. It is easy to develop your rational mind. It happens to all of us in our teenage when the rational instinct kicks in and we start arguing out and enjoying the play of logic. It happens by itself. But arriving at pure infinite is not easy. But it's not difficult either in the sense that it is so difficult that you can't get to it. So he uses this phrase, it is not altogether difficult. It does happen, in fact, to us, sometimes spontaneously. When, for example, you sit at the beach, if you're not looking at your mobile phone, if you're not making phone calls or sending messages, and just staring at the ocean, and even if you let your mind daydream, there is a point after which something touches you. Here is this rhythm of the waves again and again, the same, repeating and wide, vast, everywhere exactly the same. And something in your mind says, oh, the shore goes on and on and on. And every shore, everywhere, the same rhythm of waves, going back billions of years, and will go on for billions of years. And something in your consciousness, as if is drawn into this sense of wide, timeless, something glimpsed. At which point your phone rings and you break out of that. But if you catch that moment and choose to dwell in it, if you choose consciously then to let the experience develop, it grows more concrete, more intense. The same thing happens when you're at the height of a mountain, looking down at the valley. And you'll see inevitably, if you're traveling as a group, people are chatting as they climb. They come to the top and stop. Wow. And everyone goes silent. No one is chatting. Even your mind goes silent. And then again the modern habit, you reach into your pocket, pull out your phone and want to take pictures. But if you held back that impulse and just let that thing which hit you fill you, and the same thing happens, something in your mind opens out into this expanse. You're this littleness on the edge that forgets itself in the sheer expanse around you. And you remain in it. And you feel something drawing you into it. If you lean from the top, it feels like you're going to fall. But if you don't lean from the top, you feel as if something pulls you into this wideness. And if you just let it happen, already a first glimpse of the sense of the infinite begins to unfold. The same thing Mother recommends as an exercise, which of course you don't always have the ocean or the mountain. So she says, lie down on your terrace and gaze at the sky. And after a while she says, you forget yourself and you have just this sense of this infinity of the sky and the universe. And your little problems of life, they are like little patches of clouds which come and go. And you forget them and they don't affect you anymore. Why? Because something of your consciousness momentarily enters in relation with the sense of the infinite. And I'm using this word sense of the infinite. Here he's speaking of arriving at the pure infinite. But from having the sense of the infinite to arriving at the infinite is only a question of degree. If you catch this first sense and dwell in it consciously and let yourself be pulled into it, it pulls you. This is the nature of the drop when you drop it in the ocean. As long as you held it separate, you can say the drop feels itself separate. You drop it in the ocean, what happens if you observe at a molecular level, very quickly the ocean invades, breaks it up, and the drop is as if dispersed. Until eventually it is entirely spread out into the ocean, equally everywhere. And that's the very nature of the relationship of the finite with the infinite. What happens though is after a while, when it becomes too much, something in you shrinks back. You're on the verge, on the edge, and a sense of fear. Oh, I'm so scared, this is tall, this is too much. You pull back. It's the first glimpse or the first limit that you could accept. But the sadhaka is conscious that this is actually an experience being given to you, and even if he feels that, he says, no, let it happen. I do not fear. I want to experience the infinite. And it continues more and more. And it takes you, arriving at the pure infinite. And pure because at some point all the finitenesses, even of the forms, the scenery, the waves begin to fade out. Just the sheer sense of a vast infinity. And then he puts one more word. See, he categorizes all the experiences in all the fine degrees and stages. He says, arrive at the pure infinite and then dwell in a pure infinite. So when you arrive, it is a first experience. When you choose consciously to habituate yourself to remaining in it, you begin to dwell in the infinite, and again through degrees, until it becomes more and more complete and permanent. So, rereading the sentence, it is not altogether difficult to arrive at and dwell in a pure infinite. So much is captured in such a short sentence. And even at the same time, a perfect global experience of the existence which is consciousness, which is delight. And so this we can see as a continuance of the first step. When you have this perception of the pure infinite, you arrive at, begin to dwell more and more. How do you experience the infinite? What is it that you're experiencing? Not just the sense of a limitlessness, but limitlessness of what? How would you describe it? All you can say is, just is, an infinity that simply is. And when you dwell on this aspect of the infinite, what is it that is? Simply is something. That's the beginning of the sense of the pure existence. Or it may happen, you may feel, it is a kind of an awareness that is infinite, and that is the aspect of the consciousness. So you may begin with the entry in something which is pure existence, so you have no sense of form, just the sense of an infinite expanse. And that becomes the existence, or into it the consciousness emerges, and you have the sense of being aware in an infinite or as an infinite. And then the third degree of it is the emergence of the delight. Not always felt in any way that you would have imagined, not felt at all as an emotion, but just a deep sense of contentment is the first touch of it. A deep sense of contentment that it feels so good to be in it. And if you could, you would want to remain in it forever. What about all the other things which are interesting, exciting to your emotions? Compared to this, that's nice, but I wish I could have this filling those things. But this is innately satisfying, and a deep kind of satisfaction which is not mental, nor emotional, nor sensory. Just self-existent. That would be for us a first glimpse of what eventually deepens and grows to be the sense of the delight. And so he says, rereading the sentence, you see now how he formulates it. It is not altogether difficult to arrive at and dwell in a pure infinite, or even at the same time a perfect global experience of the existence which is consciousness, which is delight. So it is not altogether difficult to dwell in this. The mind may even extend its experience of this unity. And that comes the next step. When you're in this, you're in a certain state, which state can be disturbed. As when your mobile phone rings, and a kind of shift of your attention to the issues which are bothering you, the things which you have to deal with, your daily time schedules and responsibilities and problems. And so there is a turning of attention to the things, pieces, forces, forms, objects, conflicts. Against what? This thing which has none of those. This thing which you cannot cut up, it is just one infinite. This thing which is always content and complete. And against that, all these things. So, the mind may even extend its experience of this unity to the multiplicity, so as to perceive it immanent in the universe. So, at first, you have this double status. You flip between this or that. Or a part of you is here, a part of you is there. But at some point you can say, or you can work on it consciously and bring this awareness. Where was it when you were immersed in it? You were in it. Where was it? It was always everywhere. It is infinite. But unless I am in that special state, I do not perceive it. But since that special state is accessible to me in my waking consciousness, it's not in a state of trance. Eventually, it extends into my waking activity. So immediately after a deep concentration or experience like this, you get up, you're still in a bit of a daze. We have had so many experiences from people of similar kinds. I will share here one which was very intense, quite surprising in its form, and I had not heard of one of this degree or dramatic character. I had gone to visit a certain community, a spiritual community in the US, and in the very first evening when we arrived there was somebody who was waiting, and he was sitting there, and I was wondering why he has been waiting. And after a while he said, "Oh, you are from the ashram. I was there and I have met the mother." And so of course I was interested. But I didn't have to ask, he wanted to narrate his story. So he said he was traveling in India, in Chennai, and somebody told him about Auroville. So he came to see Auroville. This was in 1970, I think. It was very early stages of Auroville. And he came because he was an expert in certain community construction, housing, something, I don't remember what, some technical aspect of it. And he stayed for a couple of weeks in Auroville helping in that work. And then someone told him, "You should go and see the mother." And he said, "I was just one of those who has no opening to anything spiritual." He was only attracted by the ideal of what Auroville represented purely from its social and ecological aspect. And he said, "Well, why would I meet the mother?" But since they insisted, he said, "Okay, let me just go and say hi." So he got himself an appointment, and he remembers going to the mother. His first impression as he entered the room was this very small figure seated on a chair. And then he went to her, and because he seemed to think it was either he was told or he knelt down because it was the right way to sit in front of her. The moment he did that, he said, she looked into him, and there was this incredible love pouring out of her eyes. And as he was narrating, he had tears in his eyes, and he said, "She bounced me all around the universe. And I don't know for how long it was there. And all the while there was this incredible love pouring into me. And I was bouncing all over the universe, everywhere." So later I did an interview with him, and I asked him, "What do you mean by bouncing around the universe?" And he was struggling to find words, and he said, "It was as if layers and layers were unveiling from me, and it was all over the universe, everywhere, and another layer emerged, unveiling, and another layer, and I was all over the universe. And it was just so full of an infinite love that was pouring and pouring." And I said, "I don't know what happened. I don't know how I came back. I don't know how I was. For the next 3 days, I was in a complete daze. I don't even know what I did. I ate, I slept, I did things. I don't know if I met people." And after about 3 days, the experience began to fade. But it was so impactful. What do you do after that? Remember, you have lived all your life as an atheist, denying anything of spiritual value. And then suddenly this happens. What do you do? Suddenly all your existing values have no meaning. What do you look forward to? And of course the natural thing would be spend the rest of your life near the mother, right? Or in Auroville. And then he says, he went to my teacher, MP Pandit, and said, he was mother's secretary then. He said, "Please, I want to ask a question to the mother. I don't know what to do with my life. I find the ashram too restrictive, and I don't think I can live in Auroville permanently. What should I do with my life?" And so Panditji went to the mother, conveyed this. Of course, the mother knew what it was that he was going through. And Panditji came back with a letter written by the mother, addressed to the Dalai Lama, in which she introduces this man to the Dalai Lama and says, and asks him to work for the Dalai Lama for the rest of his life. And he became one of the major filmmakers and promoting the Dalai Lama, his teaching and message to the world. And so he said in conclusion, "I went to the mother and she bounced me all over the universe and then sent me to the Dalai Lama." obviously she saw in him the soul's line of development and his right place in the work. And then I asked him, have you been to the ashram afterwards? He said, no. And after a pause, he said, I'm afraid to go. I'm afraid of being disappointed. You know, when you've had such an enormous experience, to see things on a material level and to see people, objects, it will be too much of a contrast. So he would rather stay in that imprint memory of the experience than allow it to be diminished by the other things of which he has no memory anyway. Similarly, I had heard of another person who had gone to meet the mother at that time, in the early 70s. And later he went to the mother's room on one of the darshan days recently, some 10 years ago. And he came back with a very interesting comment. He said, somehow I remember when I went to meet the mother, the room was huge, it was enormous. And when I went now, it was so small. How did she live in that little room for so many years? Obviously, the memory he has is not of the physical room, but the consciousness which was enormous that lives. It was her presence and that lived in that. Similarly, when my teacher M.P. Pandit had the darshan of Sri Aurobindo, he notes in his diary, he says the only thing that would compare with him was the Himalayas. That massive consciousness and dense, deep, intense, solid, pure white peace presence. Massive. And so your impression of the person and the space is this massiveness, because that's the consciousness. Why am I describing this? I wandered from the question of being in that, the imprint of that, in that vastness, against which you have all this. And you come out of it, and then you are in this mundane world, and that stays behind. Or you can work at it consciously and extend this. Until this continues, but what is its relationship with all that you see? It is just the same infinity which fills all around. All space is nothing but this infinity. But it's not space, it's not the tangible physical space, it is something much more essential. As if it makes space possible because it is there. It is not formed of expanse that you can cut up. It is simply indivisible infinity. And so you have still this kind of a double awareness. But it fills everything because there's nothing which is not in it. So, the mind may even extend, meaning by dwelling on it you become aware that it's all here. Even extend its experience of this unity, capital U, to this multiplicity. So as to perceive it immanent in the universe. And when it is immanent, it's not just filling objects. Remember, that is somehow more essential than the sense of space. So it is as if the backdrop, not just of objects, but of object, force, movement. And he's taking pains to point to these, because if you follow the experience, you could stop with a partial perception of it by saying, oh yes, it is like space which fills everything, or in which everything exists, and so all objects are in it. No, it is more essential than the space. It even fills forces. It is the very nature of all things. So even where there is a force which is not object, it is the support. It is the infinity behind, the unity behind. Any movement, this has moved from here to here, this has moved from here to here. We're not talking of objects in physical space. The movement itself is possible because something sustains the sense of movement. So the sense of something essential, infinite unity includes the support for all object forces and movements. And by pointing to these three separately, he ensures that your perception is completed. In the universe, or at the same time to be aware of this existence, consciousness, bliss containing the universe. That's the next degree. First you're seeing it in the universe. But is it the same size as the universe? The sense of its infinity is massive. The sense of its unity transcends forms. And so you have the sense that at the same time it is beyond the universe. And the universe is a small thing that it contains in itself. And that takes your experience to a further degree. Containing the universe and enveloping all its objects. So not only it was inside objects, but it is now presiding outside and above and beyond all sense of time and space, and from there envelops. Not only the universe, but every object is as if enveloped by this thing which transcends time and space. And every object is like a crystallization of something which is beyond time and space. And finally, a third degree, originating all its movements. Where does this come from? From where does this emerge? It's from that. Where does its force, movement, energy come? From that. Everything originates from that. But still remember, it is not that. You see, that fine gap is still there. It is difficult indeed for the mind, to unite and harmonize rightly all these experiences. So what will happen at first? It will have an experience of this, or it will shift attention to this. So you feel, the presence everywhere, in everything. Or you kind of step back and you experience, you as if step back and you experience, the presence presides over the whole universe. And then you turn back, it is inside everything. And these are two different things. But in your consciousness, you're able to look at only one. How do you hold in your awareness the sense of something presiding over the universe and at the same time inside the universe? But it does happen. So he says it's a little difficult to do this, but it does happen eventually. And especially if you know it needs to be done, you can consciously participate to help it. It is difficult indeed for it to unite and harmonize rightly all these experiences. But still, it can possess Satchidananda at once in himself and immanent in all, and the continent of all. So this would be the degree to which you take it. It's within me, it is my very essence, it is the very essence of all things and in all things, and it contains all this. Nothing would be without that. That forms out of itself everything in the universe. But with this, to unite the final experience of all this as Satchidananda and possess objects, movements, forces, forms as no other than He is the great difficulty for mind. So I experienced that filling this, that containing, supporting this, that originating all the movements of this. But this, the form of it, not the containing quality inside, not the energy that fills it, the form, this is He. Something is missing. I can tell myself, oh yes, this is all form of He because there is nothing else, but I do not perceive this as Satchidananda. The form somehow eludes the perception as Himself. Elsewhere, both in the Life Divine and in his commentary on the Isha Upanishad, Sri Aurobindo speaks of these three realizations. The first is the realization of the imminence of the Divine. Everywhere, in all things, the Divine is present. The second is the realization that all this is in the Divine. And the third is all this as the Divine. This third degree is for the mind somewhat difficult because the mind always needs to keep something separate. It is unable to hold a consciousness where everything merges into a single unity. Otherwise it wouldn't be mind. So he says, And again he lists here all the things to which it can be brought to perfection. But with this, to unite the final experience of all this as Satchidananda and possess objects, so to experience this itself as He, as Lord, as Satchidananda. Movements, the movement itself is Lord and Satchidananda. It's not enough to say the object is Satchidananda, but it moves by some force. The movement itself. Forces, forms, any form, as no other than He. And you see, the sense of form is not so obvious. Why he says form as distinct from objects? We would tend to say it's the same thing. No. When you look at the ocean is object. The wave is object. But on the wave you have a ripple, a shift in form. The clay is object. You can have an object made of clay. This idol is made of clay, painted. But the form itself and the quality of its shape is an expression of the divine. The particular curvature of the wave is itself an expression of the divine. That is an extreme also to which the perception must be completed. But to get it to any of these, that is for him the great difficulty for mind. So let me reread this sentence and we let the full import of it sink in. But with this, to unite the final experience of all this as Satchidananda and possess objects, movements, forces, forms as no other than He is the great difficulty for mind. But if this one could have, one would see everywhere form of the divine, form of the Lord, Himself present as this, as that, and in every. Separately, any of these things may be done. You could even momentarily have the perception that all form is divine, all force is divine, all object is divine. But all form, force, object, movement, that somehow eludes, because it's as if the mind needs to take a special focus of orientation. For example, just as an exercise which is very accessible to our mind, you can conceive of and use the knowledge of science and what we are taught in school in physics. All this is just made of energy. Massive energy. Quantum physics, you will use the term in quantum electrodynamics. The term used is 0 point energy, which means right here in empty space there is as much energy as in the solid metal or brick or steel. Same energy. It's just the shape of the foam which is different. The foam taking one form, you say this is steel. The foam taking another form, you say this is wood. And the foam taking another form, you say this is air. But it's all same, equally all energy. You can conceive of it, you can visualize it even. And in your mind you can imprint this idea, all this is one gigantic ocean of energy, until you are able to see it as if through your physical senses. And the mind looking through the senses, one big energy. And each object becomes foam. But the movement is also that. Takes a little bit of doing. Or to say the shape of the object is the energy, something doesn't quite fit. As an artist, you could put yourself in that aesthetic mode where, oh, the beauty of this curve is so expressive of the elegance and the harmony of the divine. The form itself, yes, then your mind flips, form is an expression of the energy. Flip the curve. But to hold it all together in a single, something is always slipping the mind. The mind may go from one to the other, rejecting one as it arrives at another, and calling this lower or that the higher existence. So naturally the mind has a tendency, when it takes 2 or 3 pieces and tries to assemble them, they either become at the same level but then 2 separate, Or if you force them into unity, then one is overwhelmed by the other. This becomes subordinate to the other. So this is superior, that is inferior. That's the only way you can force unity. And so when you do that with these different aspects of the divine experience, something becomes superior, something becomes inferior. The great experience is the one where you have this, says one tradition. While another will say, no, the great experience is where it's the other, whatever form it takes. But something remains always like a gap, a separation, a hierarchy. But to unify without losing, to integralize without rejecting, is its supreme difficulty. The next chapter takes up how to deal with this difficulty. And it goes very deep into a series of experiences, some of them considered to be the most profound, the most deep, the most transcending, and so on. But he will describe each of those experiences in great detail. Why is this necessary? For example, you could speak of an experience where you have a sense of detachment from the world, a sense of being witness. And you will find the poise of witness can be had on so many different levels in so many different degrees. Your mind can feel, I feel like a witness, all this world is a bit like a dream, not very interesting for me. You can have this even when you're on certain medication, for example. You feel yourself aloof, distant, somehow not engaged because you're numb. Even that would be a sense of detachment. But he describes several levels and degrees, and by describing what it feels in each of them, he allows you to identify with each. But also if you have a particular experience, you can't say, this is it. You find out which one he is referring to. And so the whole chapter is quite fascinating when taken in this way, because the experiences are intricately described. It can even be quite boring if you read it purely philosophically. But if you read it from the perspective of a practitioner, a sadhaka, a yogi, then reading the experience tends to draw you into the glimpse of it, even if through some layer of your mind. And so we will take it in that spirit. As we have seen in the last one paragraph that we have read, the way he described these stages of arriving at a pure infinite and dwelling in it, and then the finer, further stages, reading them, dwelling on them, you can feel, yes, this is not only accessible, but it is right there. It's only a question of taking each of these steps. One can say, you start with sitting at the beach or a mountain top or lying down on your terrace, and that's good enough to start. So, all the rest being waiting for us ahead, this supreme difficulty has to be faced. So the next chapter is titled, The Passive and Active Brahman. He begins thus: the difficulty which the mental being experiences in arriving at an integral realization of true being and world being may be met by following one or other of two different lines of his self-development. The mental being can take up two different lines in his self-development to meet this difficulty. And straight away he goes into the two lines. But in a single sentence he has summarized what we have discussed in an entire chapter, and now moves to a solution. He places these two lines before us, which are also two approaches in the yoga for precisely this integration of the unity and the multiplicity. The first one, he may evolve himself from plane to plane of his own being and embrace on each successively his oneness with the world and with Satchidananda realized as the Purusha and Prakriti, conscious soul and nature soul of that plane, taking into himself the action of the lower grades of being as he ascends. So, short sentence with many phrases, ideas in a sequence, each of which can be amplified into an entire chapter and is in fact amplified in different places. Even some of the later chapters he has condensed in just a single phrase, realized as Purusha and Prakriti. And if you go down 3 chapters later, Soul and Nature is the title of a chapter. You see, the next chapter after this, passive and active Brahman, is cosmic consciousness, so in which this harmonization has been made, but it's completed in another chapter which is called oneness. But you see, that oneness experienced still organizes itself on each plane through a kind of a duality. And soul nature is the duality. Soul and nature is the duality on each plane, but different on each plane, which he elaborates in that chapter, which right now he's just giving you as a brief passing phrase. You could do this on each plane. And then he skips this method. He takes a different method for arriving at the resolution, but later in the descent from there he deals with this perspective and this method, but from the other direction. So as a result, he still gives you a complete roadmap, but the approach he takes is not going to be this way, although this way is also valid and can even move parallelly with the other approach. So, he may, now he summarizes this whole approach, he may, that is to say, work out by a sort of inclusive process of self-enlargement and transformation the evolution of the material into the divine or spiritual man. This is the summary of what was just described in a pretty complex way, which we will also look at shortly, but this is the summary. The gist of it makes sense. You go level to level, including, enlarging, transforming, including again all that was, enlarging, transforming, and from a new poise, again including all that was before, enlarging, transforming to a new level, and so on, again and again. And you can see this whole approach is reminiscent of the whole approach of evolution itself. Each time a new grade of consciousness emerges, it turns back to all that was developed so far, takes it all up bit by bit and raises it to its own level as far as it can, and then turns to something higher until it grasps and expresses something more. And again includes all the rest, raises it up, and so on. So in the animal consciousness, the whole animal instinct turns not only to its body and the material part, turns to its energy and emotional part, turns to its semi-developed rationality and mental awareness. Out of that, when the human rationality emerges, it takes up all the rest again and raises them all. So we still have a body which is of the same derivation as the animal, but there's something fundamentally different. Our body is fundamentally more conscious, even self-conscious. I can feel in my hand my own awareness. A monkey cannot do that. Its hand is still an instinctive awareness. Even as in my mind I am able to be self-aware, I am able to be that in my body. But there are human beings who do not have that, who are so unconscious. They can do things totally unaware that they are doing those things. Totally unaware of how it impacts people around. And it's just because those layers are not conscious. But when they become conscious, suddenly it's a new grade of human living. So even within humanity you find all these gradations. And that's just the physical body and body awareness. Similarly with the emotions. There are so many people who are not even conscious they're upset. They're angry, they're upset, they express with all the anger that they have, but if you tell them, why are you angry? I'm not angry. They're not conscious. Or they enter into a state of denial. And so on. At each level, the self-aware mind takes up and makes more self-aware, more conscious, and raises to the highest of its level. At which point it begins to turn to something still higher than itself, as if wanting to complete. And when it gains that, again it turns down and rebuilds all this. This happens in our life. When as children, we grew and began to take charge of our life on the basis of our limited awareness, self-awareness and world awareness. As we grew, became more mature, we recast, reshaped, reorganized our life. And when we don't, eventually there is a disconnect, some misalignment with the pressure of life around, which forces you to break your current patterns, rhythms, and review and recast, reprioritize, and keeps happening. But these are very fine steps. Here he is describing on much larger steps exactly the same process in more detail. And then he says of this approach, this seems to have been the method of the most ancient sages, of which we get some glimpse in the Rig Veda and some of the Upanishads. In the footnote he writes, notably the Taittiriya Upanishad. So what it is in the Taittiriya we will perhaps look at next time. But with this backdrop, that this was the approach of some of the most ancient rishis, and of which you have a glimpse in the Rig Veda, let's look at what it is he has described in the more detailed sentence. I'll first reread the sentence, then we'll look at the pieces. He may evolve himself from plane to plane of his own being and embrace on each successively, on each plane, embrace on each successively his oneness with the world and with Satchidananda, realized as the Purusha and Prakriti, that is the poise of conscious soul and nature soul of that plane. Taking into himself the action of the lower grades of being as he ascends. So this last part, taking into himself the actions of the lower grades, we have already described. From each plane you turn down to all the rest which has formed you and raise it. But what does it mean to realize oneness with the world and with Satchidananda, not in its unity but as Purusha and Prakriti, conscious soul and nature soul? What does that mean? So that is what will be in that chapter where he discusses Satchidananda representing itself on each plane in this double status. And the unity, oneness with the world. So we'll dwell upon this briefly now and perhaps develop it more next time when we take the example of the Taittiriya Upanishad. You see, on each plane, if you follow the natural instinct of the human being, you will see a common pattern. You first began as a semi-conscious, physically, little child. Your awareness of things is only the things around you, immediately around. And the awareness itself is so limited that you've fallen and hurt yourself. When you think of and look at the injury, you cry. But if momentarily your attention is distracted and you say, oh, look at that bird, and the child looks up and forgets his pain. See, the center of organized awareness is not yet very developed. That same child, when he has grown a little more, if you try to distract him, he knows you're trying to distract him and he refuses to be distracted and wants to insist on this. So the kind of a self-awareness has developed, and this is the part of the evolution of the conscious awareness of Purusha, self-aware conscious soul. At the same time, it is entering in relation with the nature. And nature, starting with your own nature, the child gets a bump. First he is surprised. He experiences pain. It's a new experience. He's surprised. And then he looks around. And then he sees you rush. Oh, did you hurt yourself? And then he suddenly realizes, oh yes, I'm supposed to be hurt. I'm supposed to be somehow more disturbed. And the instinct of the crying kicks in. And he starts crying. And then meanwhile the adult says, oh, it's nothing. You have not hurt yourself. And the adult walks away. And the child is surprised. And he cries louder to gain attention. And if you don't pay attention, somewhere eventually he gives up. And you can see that it's a whole attempt, a struggle to engage with your environment and to know and somehow find your right place in things. And at that point it's very sensory, very physically emotional, which same process continues as you grow in age. In teenage, you enter in banter with your colleagues. You enter in struggles, fights, conflicts. And you will find often, if you have not been through that process, you have not found your right way to deal with people. You are as if finding the limits of their emotions. How far can you push? How far can you be pushed? And there's a whole learning process around. Who is learning? This awareness now which has grown a step higher. In adulthood, the same process is continuing much more sophisticated. Now you're engaging, not so obviously, not in direct collision, but nudging, prodding, feeling, sensing. What are you doing actually? You're becoming conscious of the processes of things, that's nature, from an awareness, which is soul. And on each level, you're developing this. And on each, you are engaging to find what? Some sense of underlying unity and connection with things. If at some point you said, that's enough, I'm quite fed up with this whole thing, I cut myself off from the whole world, you'll find after a while you begin to suffocate. Why? Because the deepest instinct within you is to engage and find unity. Because that is the deeper truth of you. Except that at each plane, each level of your consciousness, the unity is experienced in terms of that impulse. So at the physical level, it is experienced through sensations and almost material exchange of any kind, through food, through objects exchanged. At an emotional level, it is through engagement emotionally, through energies being given in whatever form. And it's interesting that sometimes you have very strong relationships with people in hatred, which is equivalent to the same intensity in affection, of love. It's the same degree of engagement, except it has a perversion. But the engagement is still through the emotions. And in the domain of thought, it is through exchange of ideas, ideals, or experiences, learning, and so on. So on each level, it finds its own particular type, and the unity through that type of consciousness. So rereading, he may evolve himself from plane to plane of his own being and embrace on each successively his oneness with the world, and with Satchidananda realized as the Purusha and Prakriti, conscious soul and nature soul of that plane. So on each level it is your awareness which is shifted one level of that grade of emotions, sensations or thoughts, and the nature on each of those. And that's the nature of the Satchidananda on that plane that you're learning, realizing, and discovering the unity there. He may, that is to say, work out by a sort of inclusive, one more line I missed, taking into himself the action of the lower grades of being as he ascends. So each time you go up, taking all the level lower and raising it, and so on. He may, that is to say, work out by a sort of inclusive process of self-enlargement and transformation, the evolution of the material into the divine or spiritual man. So what is happening through this process? You started by a material humanity, you're growing to a spiritual or divine humanity, and at each step you're taking up all that you are below and raising, widening, raising. Where would it end if you continued like this? At each wider level, your sense of oneness is more complete or more true. At the level of your refined, idealistic thoughts, we say this today, humanity is one big family. Do you feel it? Do you experience it? Do you realize it? A little bit. But before you experience and realize it, it's an idea that catches you, almost like a fancy. You start throwing those words around. But at some point when you dwell on it or you begin to work for it, you begin to experience it, you have shifted up. And at that point suddenly all your personal drives, desires, cravings, instincts, they seem a little out of alignment. I did all this for myself. I need to give more. And many people you will see who have accumulated, they will say, I have accumulated so much, I want to give back to society. Give back? Because I took from society all this while, right? I have to give back. Or it may be in a different form. Give through ideas. Sri Aurobindo actually gives this very interesting image. At the physical consciousness, your instinct is to procreate, to create a replica of yourself. But in the domain of thought, your instinct also is to replicate yourself by infusing those ideas and experiences in others, teaching others, helping others to grow. But what are you doing? You're actually creating or helping to create an image of what you have gained in another form. Same process. And you'll see certain fundamental instincts which appear so crude at a physical level. The instinct itself changes grade and quality of consciousness as the soul rises and as it engages with a refined and more complete nature. So what's happening? You started with this crude human, physical human, and the same impulses become larger, more complete, more refined, more true, more divine. Until in the end, it would complete in embracing the whole universe as yourself, as your own other self, including all humanity and all creatures and all things, as your own other selves, in the unity of the Satchidananda unveiled, which Satchidananda is reflecting in a more and more veiled form through this duality of I and nature on all the planes. If you just look at this one picture, the whole perspective of evolution changes. Your whole vision of your own growth and your journey of where you're going is somehow different. And if you hold this idea and review your relationships with people and things, that alone will be greatly liberating. If you realize this is where you're going to go eventually, and this begins now to creep into your current values and instincts, you'll find many things change and become simpler. You help people not because of what benefit you will get. You help because it's the right thing to do. It's the movement of evolution. It's the fulfillment of yourself, because it's yourself in the other. And then you do what you have to do. And still, of course, practically you put limits, because you cannot help to a point where you lose yourself. And so there has to be this balance still between soul and nature. But when it reaches completeness, in the oneness of the Satchidananda, the same thing becomes a spontaneous movement, and the balance is innate to the whole play. So this is one way. Doesn't it seem like the best way? It is actually the way of evolution in a certain sense. The other way, he says, he may on the other hand aim straight at the realization of pure self-existence on the highest plane of mental being, and from that secure basis realize spiritually, under the conditions of his mentality, the process by which the self-existent becomes all existence. But without that descent into the lower, without that descent into the self-divided, egoistic consciousness, which is a circumstance of evolution in the ignorance. So short, rapid way would be get all the way to that poise where you have already or can recover that base in which you can become all existence, bypassing all those degrees of the ego gradually widening. And you can see how that would enormously accelerate the whole process, though it would bring in a few complexities also. In practice, the two need not be contradictory. While you're working to rise straight up and develop that full awareness of the oneness with all things, meanwhile, at each step also this is happening, where the gradual widening and integration also continues. Increasingly, as this becomes active, the whole movement takes a larger and larger movement and rapidly brings it to a great completion, without rejecting anything, without cutting or losing anything. Thus identified with Satchidananda in the universal self-existence as the spiritualized mental being, he may then ascend beyond to the supramental plane of the pure spiritual existence. So there would still be that one degree of completion because you are still in a spiritualized mind before. It is the latter method, the stages of which we may now attempt to trace for the seeker by the path of knowledge. So this will be the theme for the rest of the chapter. We'll pause here and hold this big picture. If possible, over the coming week, try to bring elements of this, including what we read in the previous chapter, as well as this, into your perspective. And you will see rapidly, reading those lines or dwelling on them or allowing them to settle in you as a first glimpse or even a first experience will bring about certain changes rapidly in your whole worldview. So for next time we will dwell upon this reference he gives to the Taittiriya and consolidate this idea. These last two lines dwell upon certain nuances which are suggested there before we proceed with the chapter. And we can take up any comments or questions that you have now. This chapter? What we have now just started is called the passive and active Brahman. And the previous chapter which we just finished was the difficulties of the mental being. Yes, it's worth rereading. Yes.
There's one question that accompanies me quite a while. I received quite some teachings from Tibetan Buddhism, from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And one of the very main points they emphasize or they point out is the disappearing of the observer and the true seeing. So they say as long there is an observer or experiencer in the experience, it's not the true seeing. Yes. So what they very much emphasize, even mainly when they check your experience, is there any fascination about the experience? Mm-hmm. Is there excitement? Is there remembrance, memory in the beginning? Because as long there is memory, there is excitement, there is an experiencer, it's not the true seeing. And actually I checked the synthesis of yoga, Force and Beck, if there is any hint of Aurobindo to this point which is so crucial to Buddhist tradition. And actually I didn't really find out, just very few points where it might point to this. So I would be very interested if you could tell something about this.
Okay. So Sri Aurobindo discusses this in great detail in the Life Divine, and also in the Synthesis of Yoga it is there, but not in as much detail for this purpose. What he points out is that in your power of knowledge, you start with a very divided consciousness, which is natural to the mind. You have an observer, you have an observed object, and then there's the whole process of observation itself, which can cloud the perception and so on. But increasingly, the power of perception and the observing consciousness, as they ascend, the cognitive process itself undergoes a change. The process of thought and thinking itself fades out and is replaced by direct seeing. There is still someone who is seeing what he sees, and the seeing process itself. And then as it ascends further, this undergoes a change where the seeing process and the seen and the observer become more and more merged, until in what he calls the intuitive consciousness, you know not by a process of thinking or seeing, but by being one with what you know. But even that is not enough. You still know in part, and there are other parts. And so there is a widening now of the consciousness itself, which is one, into a larger and greater and more complete oneness. Of course, the mind cannot take it beyond a point. It can even take to glimpses of the infinity, but from a perspective. And then another perspective can still look at the same infinite but differently. Even in identity, it is experiencing it differently. And so there is still not the final resolution. It is only in the supramental consciousness where every possible viewpoint is included in one single whole experience, undivided, that you have the final harmony. So he describes the whole ascent of the cognitive process and the cognition, power of cognition itself, all the way up, but in a continuum. Now this principle, once you recognize it, applies in all experience. As long as you have a mind, there will always be a separation of the observer and the observed. But in the mind awareness itself, a merging can take place to a point, after which it has to ascend beyond mind if it wants to take it to a perfect cognition, where you are one entirely. Not just with that, but with all. So again, there are degrees there. In the normal text, since the goal is not just to get to one level, but a series of experiences and many aspects and levels, he does not repeat this everywhere. That's why you don't see it frequently.
Does it mean one can equal observer and mind? Like dualistic observer and mind?
The current consciousness in which you're observing is a mental consciousness. Okay, so there are higher grades of consciousness where the same process of cognition would be there, but completely different.
So it means from the plane of supramental consciousness, this duality is over.
There's no duality anymore there. There is utter oneness. But the oneness includes all possible viewpoints and all possible experiences as a multiplicity, simultaneously with the unity. Even though there is a finer level of complexity to the question, when you say the sense of observer is gone, what are you? You're in an experience. But there's a perception, or there's a experiencing of the experience, right? The consciousness in which the experiencing takes place, depending on its limitations, the experiencing is limited. Okay? So there can still be within that consciousness, especially if it is a mental consciousness, a part that stands back observing the experiencing itself. And so one could still discover a poise of observer which describes the experience without ever losing the oneness with the experience. If you didn't have that, then you would be completely lost for words. You would be knocked out from any capacity to express, which is not the case. Even in the greatest immersion and self-loss, there's a capacity to be able to, as if, stand back and know or articulate in terms which you have difficulty to express, but still you are able to articulate something of it. You see? And this power is secretly the It points to a poise in consciousness where observer and the subjectivity and objectivity themselves are seen only as two aspects of one consciousness. And they are no more separate, they are no more contradictory, and you no more have one instead of the other. You have both at the same time. So even in the highest realizations, you're subjectively one with the realization, but you have a power to stand back from it and observe it without ever being separate from it. You get the point. It's not a mental separation though. It is only a status taken by the same consciousness for a practical purpose.
Sir, how to get rid of bad dreams? Although I know that keep remembering mother and that, and I do that with the, before sleeping. Even then, I am caught in the bad dreams, especially during when I rise late and the last part of
yes. When you wake
the
up.
sleep.
Yes. If you notice the content of your night sleep is in many ways a reflection of your day. The quality or grade of consciousness of the sleep is almost always the same as the grade of consciousness in which you entered the sleep. So if just before sleeping you have watched the TV news, watched some disaster, some disturbing images, something inside you is shaken. You may not be conscious, but something is disturbed emotionally. And so when from there you go into sleep, that part which is disturbed is still remaining agitated.
Sir, I don't watch.
Okay, yes, I'll come to that. But I'm just first describing the principle. Okay?
This I'm just struggling to get rid of.
Yes,
Sorry,
yes.
I'm just struggling to get rid of.
I'll come to your specific situation, but I want to give a big picture because it's a general question which will be of relevance to everybody. So the first correction we do is the entry point of sleep we try to make as still and quiet as possible, but also as high in our current access of awareness. What is your highest available consciousness today at this moment? It may not be what the best you have had ever, but somewhere today what you're able to do, but also as still and quiet as possible. In that poise, settling in all the rest of you, including your physical and emotional. So if necessary, if you're conscious that there's still some agitation in some layer, when I saw that image, there was a shock. Or somewhere in the beginning of the day, I had a shock, and something of that disturbance still remains, perhaps. You quiet yourself entirely, hold yourself in your highest poise. One very effective means to help settle is to read something which lifts your consciousness. But still you must consciously extend it all the way to the most material part. Many people find it helpful to read from Sri Aurobindo's Savitri. But whatever means you use at that moment, or simply sitting in quiet concentration or meditation, that's the first correction for the grade of consciousness you enter. Then the activities of the day and the thoughts in the day, the emotional habits of the day, those are the things then which tend to pop up in the night. And sometimes they may not always be things which you have directly felt as emotions, but which you may have caught as an infection from the environment, which also may pop up. Let's say you are interacting with somebody who has some strong internal emotional struggles. But if as a parent or as a friend you are open to them, sometimes those things tend to get into you and they may also pop up in the dream. They are not yours, but they come up. Or they may even come from the environment. Often we are not conscious of this. It's a very strange thing. When you're living in flats, where in a single building you have many flats next to each other, your bed is against the wall, with your head close to the wall. You don't know what's just behind the wall. Right there is somebody else. You don't know what they're doing, what they're thinking, what's their level of consciousness. A meter away from you. Of course it has an influence. Of course it has an impact, isn't it? You pick up things. And your sleep can be greatly disturbed if a meter away from you there's somebody who's having either horrible thoughts or horrible dreams or is in a state of consciousness which is extremely agitated or disturbed. You will catch it because you're open to it. So now, all of this needs to be dealt with. So not only entry point of sleep, not only observing the kinds of thoughts and emotions you have during the day which would tend to pop up, but also things which come from the environment, which you catch unconsciously. You observe all this. If you can detect what is the quality of the dream, where you feel it came in from, you will know even from where it comes and you can block it. Otherwise, you go through a process. Before sleeping, you sit on your bed, you concentrate, meditate, consciously invoke the protection around you. Invoking the Mother's presence, the Divine presence in whatever way you feel most helpful and easy. But you must invoke, and in your awareness, the entire space of your room. If you like, you can extend it to the house, but otherwise the entire space of your room, you visualize or hold in your awareness that space and invoke a peace, light and force of protection into that entire space, with the intention that no disturbing thoughts or energies will come in. Nothing is permitted. They would simply bounce off from that environment where you will invoke this. The result will be to create a kind of a cocoon of protection which will neutralize this. Still, there are things which may pop up, which have got inside you and then pop up. So there you put a certain intention, a will. The beauty of it is this: just as those negative things can pop in without your knowledge, you can infuse things also in your subconscious with knowledge, isn't it? And you can infuse a conscious intention, a positive intention. And what is consciously infused can often be far more powerful than what is picked up unconsciously. But it has to be done. And so there what you do is, whatever peace and stillness you have brought into yourself through your reading, concentration, you put an intention that this should sink deep into your subconscious, purify those regions, neutralize those disturbing habits. And they are only habits. So in your mind you treat them like this. All habits can be dissolved or changed.
Actually, this is the habit of childhood.
Yes.
I know that in childhood I suffered in that way, and those dreams are coming, still coming.
Okay.
After a
Then you work on the
lot of
protection.
effort.
Perhaps from the protection, from the environment, something is got.
Thank you, sir.
But you can see there are many different angles to a situation, and one needs to become conscious or deal with all of them. Good.
When you don't have any dream.
So when you don't have any dream, it can mean one of three things. It can mean either that...
Only vision.
Yes, okay, that's different.
Sometimes when
Yes, yes. It can be, as in your case perhaps, one rises in a consciousness which is not mechanical. And so what you retain from there are the visions or some memory of a state of consciousness rather than dreams. Because that is your primary base, focus of your awareness. Or it may be, sometimes people have gaps and so on the return they lose the thread. But what does happen, which we are not conscious of, is that during the dream state, you are not one person, you are not one grade of consciousness, you are this whole pile of gradations. Many things are happening on all possible levels, and they are already happening even if you don't register them. And sometimes it's worth it that you don't register them. So it's an interesting experience one can have, that on the return waking up from dream, you actually are aware of 2 or 3 dreams, but in the immediate return, your mind slots them next to each other. I had this dream, then this, but I don't know how it transitioned from this to that. Often when you have this, what's actually happened is you had dreams on different levels. And when you came out, it was the end point of all of these, and you caught one or more of them. I first experienced this consciously when I had some physical discomfort which woke me up. And I was working at that time perhaps to remember dreams. And suddenly I remembered 3 different dreams, all of which ended with that physical disturbance waking up. And that's when I realized, oh, it was actually happening on 3 different levels. The question though is, which level are you dominantly living in during your day? And it's generally that which you tend to remember more, or the state that you entered into sleep, and the dream of that level which you remember more. But there are activities on other levels all the time. That's the nature of our human consciousness. It's multi-layered, multifaceted, multidimensioned. And it's good that you don't remember all that. Much of it is meaningless anyway. So the best would be that you can consciously enter in a high state of consciousness, in a stillness, remain as in a meditation, as if sometimes having visions or images or some beautiful experiences there, and you come out from that, and that's the best thing to retain. In a sense then, the spiritual journey continues through the sleep and into the next day, without being swallowed up by the subconscious.
But only 15 years.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. It takes time to get to it, but once you get it, it is entirely worth it. We can close this for today, and we continue it next week, on Friday next.